So he's going to be in here?
Yes, well, he was trying to be on. We're on.
Just give me a yell when you're done.
Yes. Hello, can anyone hear me?
Who chairs this committee?
Hello? Hello? Who's there?
Hey, this is Robin Hyatt.
Oh, hi, Robin. How are you? This is Kim
I'm good. How are
Evans.
you?
And Ann Bullock's here too.
Hi, Robin.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Wesley.
Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Hi, Dr. Graham.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good.
Sure.
Hi. Good. I'm Ann Bullock.
And Dr. Graham and
With a
Dr.
beard.
Boyd are on, and Miss Hyatt.
Michael's supposed to come. Michael.
You can go ahead and start. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our subcommittee meeting, and I want us to really dig in about the accountability model and think about the question that I had sent to everyone about what do we value that EPP should be measured by and accountable for. And I had sent everyone 4 different documents about other accountability models, and then our accountability measures, as well as comparing between states, that spreadsheet, and then what was it? Oh, the feedback from EPPs across the state. So I want us to go ahead and dive right in. This is, people can add to the discussion. We can look at particular items that are actually on the agenda, the different documents. But it's an open discussion.
What's up? No kidding. I don't know why I sit over here. I like these windows.
It's colder over there. It's kind of cold.
Not in my jacket. Kim, I don't know that. Do I have those documents or they're just up there?
I'm also gonna share my screen,
But I might have
but
to
I'd
look
sent them earlier.
to the committee.
Friday afternoon. Morning, I guess.
I'd sent them over time, but then I put them all in one email on Friday. Gotcha. Got it. That's what I have. Yeah. Is there a particular document we wanna look at first?
Just taking a minute to get my stuff set up here. Sorry. Kim, I had one question when I was reviewing this the other night that just came up for me again as I'm looking at the accountability cross-state comparison. It lists out kind of the 7 things that we had asked deans to respond to in the survey. 5 of them have a required by law X. So those are the 5 that Senate Bill 599 puts into law.
Right.
Just want to make sure I understood that right. Yep. I mean, that actually opened up a question for me as I was thinking through this around, column 3, by law, we have to, measure and hold accountable for the average score on pre-professional skill tests or college entrance exams, which seems like the baseline. Like I think last time Dr. Wood was talking about that being like even like Praxis 1 stuff, but then we don't by law have to measure pass rate on licensure exams. So what folks are coming out of, am I interpreting that correctly, that like one is just kind of measuring the entrance and one would actually be measuring like them passing the licensure exams once they finish the program?
The pass rate is on the licensure exams as they finish the program, and then the other,
But it's not required by law. Is that right?
no, that's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
It's required by accreditation.
Accreditation. Yeah.
Well, let me rephrase that. Most people use the licensure test as an accreditation data point. When I say most, I mean 99%.
Gotcha.
Would you agree with that?
Yep.
The,
Maybe 100.
I think I hear your kind of issue with this overall, that's right, and that the first measure, the pre-professional skills test, isn't really a measure of anything of value, whereas the licensure pass rate is a measure of value. Or at least that's how, I mean, when I think about it, that's exactly what this is, right?
Right.
You have disproportionate numbers of students who actually take those tests depending on the campus, right? Some campuses, the vast majority of students are taking the PPST. Some campuses, a
Very few.
minority, very few of our students are taking the PPST, right? So there's no sense of equality amongst campuses with the PPST, as opposed to the licensure exam where everyone has to do it if they're going to be licensed, right?
Yeah.
And the licensure exam is actually a measure of what you did in your time in the teacher prep program.
Yeah.
Whereas the Praxis Core is a measure of what you did as a high school student.
Yep.
And also with alternative licensure, that's a different set of rules, so that doesn't make it common across.
Yeah.
So I think that's another reason to consider possibly the delineation of the pre-professional test.
Interesting.
It blocks entrance, but for the residency license, the way lateral entry is now, you don't have to have those test scores. That's another measure. You just have to have it depends on the area, you know that, Andrew. So like there's no, like TFAers don't come in and say, what's your SAT score? I mean, they're high, but also anyone that's hired in a district, they're not saying what's your SAT score or what's your Praxis 1 unless their GPA is too low.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's not a common indicator.
Yeah.
And I think we need to think about that, right? Because we have different routes to teach in North Carolina, and we're supportive of that. And therefore, the goose and gander analogy, that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Any comments from the field, AKA the phone, on that statement? And that was Ann, by the way. The ones about, when you go over somewhere and there's the ones about clinical requirements, you know, like North Carolina requires a diversity of clinical placements. But I was curious if we had any more information on meeting that. I call those the assurances. So these are different. There's some assurances that we have to have for North Carolina that are not on here. And one of them is that, but I saw it on one of these, on my phone, one of these charts. So are we just looking for hard data points on this chart? These are just, for this one, these are just hard data points, quantitative
Yeah.
data
This
points.
right here is the feedback from the field.
Okay, yeah, quality, proficiency of growth toward the beginning teachers. Okay. And they rank them? Is that what they did?
Yes, so they said whether they disagreed or agreed, and you can see the 5 is closer to the agree,
Okay,
and 1 is the disagree.
okay.
One other purely clarifying question. Is it in column H on this spreadsheet? It says NC A&T State University, and in column L, it says NC A&T University. Am I to presume that H is actually NC State University?
Oh, I see
No,
Bart.
some campuses submitted multiple responses.
Interesting.
did.
Got it. Did not understand
Yes.
that. Thank you.
Being on this group, I didn't submit.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So-
We allowed for that.
Yeah.
So when I looked at this data, I actually, I went through it and collapsed the two highest categories and the two lowest categories, meaning I put the agrees together and the disagrees together and tallied it up that way rather than taking an average. And if you look at across all of the different pieces, the only one in which more campuses disagreed than agreed was the value add one.
I would imagine.
But in all
so.
of the other cases, when you look at this, it's nearly 2-to-1 agree. So even though the average comes out to be 3.33, the vast majority actually are in
So what were the top two, Michael? The EdTPA?
yeah, unfortunately, I left the paper in my office.
So I would imagine it was the licensure exams and the EdTPA.
It's the one with the highest score, right? Ends up being
Yeah.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Because those are the two things we can somewhat control.
Right.
I think that EVOS is a piece of the puzzle, though. I mean, it is what it is.
And it's also required by law.
It's required by law. Part of me thinks that, while the data is not perfect, none of this data is
No.
perfect, right?
No.
It's the best available data at the time. And
Right.
It does shed a little bit of light on when you use it in the aggregate and when you combine it with other sources of data. I don't know, certainly on my own campus, we don't look at any individual data point
Right.
on its own as a measure of anything more than what it is.
Yep.
But we actually look for, trends in the data, and I think this is an important piece, like you
Yeah.
are saying, that it can point in a direction for a campus to actually look at.
Are there any states, because I know some of this information talked about other states and kind of what their protocol is. Does anyone do like 2 or more? So, like if you get deemed in one area, that's not a trend to me. It might be something that you need to be looking at yourself. But if there are 5 indicators, say, let's just say there are 5, and you have 2 or more that are a problem, then it needs to go. I'm using number 2, just thinking that's 2 data points.
Well, if we have, how many points we're
There's
proposing?
4 or 5.
I thought it was up to 6. I thought it was 6.
Then maybe it's 3 data points. But I'm wondering if you had 2, you would be below 70%.
Yes,
If we did like a percentage that matched the percentage,
Yep.
right? So like if you have 6, they'd be worth what each? 5 would be 20%. You'd be less than 70% overall, right? Like
Yep.
if you get if there are 5 data points and 20 points each, then if you had 2 that were out, you'd be at 60%.
Right.
Just doing simple and math. So I think we ought to think about, if you don't have one of them, then that's something you need to look at, and that can be helpful in your accreditation or an improvement plan, like a school improvement plan, so to say. But if you've got 2 of them, then what? See, they do it like percentage, right?
And we're looking at here what measures are to be included, correct? Are we also talking about process here? So this
That's more of a process question.
question, which is what happens
I think we
when?
really want to focus on what measures
measures?
right now. Prior to process.
So I think Georgia always has it together, right?
They really do.
They do. They have Anne Marie Felton, who's runs their higher ed commission stuff. So I kind of like the program measures and the outcome measures in separate categories. I don't know that I always agree with the perceptions of supervisors. I guess that would be like principals.
Yeah, I think they mean principals in this case, right? So for us, this would be employer perceptions, right?
Employer perceptions.
First year teacher perceptions.
And observation data.
Observation data
which we
is
already
our
collect.
NESIS data. And then I think we need a 4th outcome measure, which would be the EVOS data
Right.
for
Right.
Right, which is required.
when it is available, when available.
Yeah, and you could do 2020, 1010 or something like that. Like you could do it
And I think with the issue
15,
being
15, 10,
the
10.
the EVOS data is by far the most controversial,
Right.
right? So
And maybe you start with it being smaller and ramp and see how it goes, like percentage wise.
I think we also need to be mindful, right, that we are now within a state where we are eliminating test after test. We're now moving towards to being a state where the only tests that we are implementing are those that are federally required, which means that upwards of 60+% of teachers in North Carolina are
Right.
not teaching a tested subject. So the programs that are most heavily impacted by this are elementary, middle grades
In high school.
reading, high school English, high school math. It's not across the board.
Right.
We would have a lot of programs for which there is
Nothing.
no value add score. And so there's an unequal impact, not only across license areas, but across teacher prep programs. Larger programs could be more differentially impacted than smaller programs.
Yeah.
And smaller programs who are only running one program, that could be a
Yeah.
huge impact on them if they prepare only elementary teachers.
Right. So you got to have that N=5 thing too.
So I want us to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
In terms of the weighting, right? In
Correct.
terms of the weighting.
Correct. And what happens if it's not weighted? Do the other weights change?
Yep,
Right.
right.
So you have like A and B, like outcome A, outcome B scenarios. Does that make sense, Kim?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Outcome A and outcome B. If you don't have any tested EVOS, if you have no value added, the other percentages would go up to make it equal 50%.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
If you have value added, that would be part of your 50%.
Be part of your 50%. And program measures, I think, so we've got pedagogy assessment would be our licensure pass rates. Content assessment is the same for us.
No, content would be licensure and pedagogy would be like a TPA.
Okay.
Huh.
Yep. And you also, again, have some areas that don't have a licensure test.
Limited though.
Yeah, limited.
CTE mostly.
BK,
BK.
if you're go through a traditional program. But very limited, and many, like, we make them take it, so.
That'd be negligible. The so for us, Kim, we would be talking about outcome measures, perceptions of first-year teachers, perceptions of employers, principal ratings on the NESIS data, value add data when available. That's 4, and then on the other side, the program measures. It's licensure exam, the content exam, and then the Ed TPA. Am I missing?
I believe that is.
That's the 6 measures that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
I think so.
Because cohort GPA and all that you have to have, but that's not a measure. That's not an outcome measure.
GPA, evaluation of graduates.
And we already report on that from report cards.
Right.
Yeah,
Graduate survey,
interesting.
pass rate.
Yeah, it's put out there.
And if other data becomes available at some point,
Yeah, so,
want to revisit that for inclusion, right?
and they have to be common instruments, right? So, North Carolina currently doesn't do all common, reliable, and valid instruments on these things. There's a suite of surveys that do that. Anthony, you're on here, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I use the Deans for Impact suite, which is not a cost thing. And so we use the employer survey that's modified from North Carolina. So I think we need to, I know that, again, I'm into logistics, but I think there's some surveys we could look at that would possibly already be in existence that might be able to be adopted if that's what we wanted to do. Because they have to be reliable and valid for us to be able to use them in our accreditation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want this commission to adopt something that I can't use in my accreditation, but I'm required to use.
Right. Well, with the bill that's being discussed too for the long session, it was in our last meeting. It was the very last thing we talked about. It's currently labeled MK9.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the MK9 bill is the teacher prep dashboard.
Yes.
And that dashboard has some of these very same measures, and
Yes.
I'm hoping that there have been comments on that bill. My hope is that we can bring that bill into alignment with these
Yes.
expectations, and
Yeah.
we end up with one set of metrics at least, in terms of performance metrics, that are being collected on that dashboard, that are being used by this commission.
Yeah, it should align,
Yes.
right? Should align. I mean,
And that would include
that's with, John Denning. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Yes, he is.
It's now.
Yeah. Senator, Representative Horn's bill.
Yes, yes.
But you're talking about the dashboard.
I'm talking about the
The
dashboard.
dashboard itself, that will come as a result of the bill.
Correct.
Going back to this, the point you made about the EVOS data, you know, as we eliminate tests, maybe less and less, maybe still important, but less helpful because you've got a huge group. My mind already started going to like when policy then starts to create like perverse, you know, actions, right? So it's like if we're actually weighting EVOS heavily, which I would be for that because I think like some of these to me are like, oh great, like the analogy I have in mind is like the NFL. And I'm like, great, a lot of these are like combine measures. Can you run the 40-yard dash? How fast do you do this? Like, what are your interviews like? But what I actually care about is like when you get out on the field, can you perform? And that's tied to outcomes of what we're training teachers to be able to do. So I think you have to have EVOS or something like it. But then the question I have is like, oh, but then are we actually creating a system where if I'm an EPP, whether it's an alternative licensure EPP or an IHE, and I quickly realize I can game the system by only offering programs that are tied to non-EVOS subjects, I'm going to never get dinged on that score. But then the policy and the procedures actually creates, you know, the adverse effect is it's safer for EPPs to do programs that aren't tied to what our greatest needs are. Not only our greatest needs in terms of where teachers are needed, math, science,
Right.
but also in terms of what we actually know is good for students and for our communities and for like the state of North Carolina's long-term prospects. So there's a part of me, and I was looking, and I think it caught my eye. I don't know if this is what Florida means, but they measure, I guess, placement rates. No, I don't think that is actually what they mean now that I think about it. But
Florida's heavily tested, right?
yeah,
Florida's super heavily tested. They test as much as North Carolina does.
okay.
So
You mean, but this in terms of placement rates, I think is actually employment.
Okay.
And the problem with that would be you've got some campuses that are gonna have really high employment rates.
Yep.
Right? State universities, large regional universities, they're gonna have high employment rates.
Yep.
You're gonna have some of the independent colleges that are gonna have very low,
70% out of state.
yeah, because they go to other
Go
places.
leave. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Huh.
It is
I need to sit
measured
with
in the
that. I'm not
report
sure I'm
card,
worried about that.
but it's measured in the report card, right?
Yeah, I think,
So,
so I think
but
there's
it's
a
not a
difference in-
ding of any
I think
type.
there's a difference in what we want to see on a report card
Then what
within
we
that-
want to
within
measure
the
as an
bill,
outcome.
and what we want to use as a measure for accountability purposes,
Yeah.
right? And so
Right,
I
that
feel like the
sanction.
6 accountability,
Interesting.
the 6 measures we have right now, right, we can use for accountability, right? You either meet these or you don't. Other things we could, look at are things like in Florida, they measure retention rates. I think a 1-year retention rate is a good measure. Beyond 1 year, you start to worry a little bit about working conditions and other
Yep.
factors that influence
Yep,
that.
But do
That
they
was
have the
also an
That's in the MK bill.
yeah?
um,
Do they have the preparation to at least make it through the
To make it
hardest
through
year
the
of your
first year
teaching
into the
career?
second
Yes.
year.
Are you talking about SITs? Andrew, were you talking about number 6?
No, I was talking about 1, but let me just share where I was going with this, and that's helpful too to think like, okay, accountability is more the stick.
Yeah.
But
we're gonna end up with a dashboard that's gonna have all kinds of data on it,
well,
right?
that's but the part of what, and this came up on a call we were having with Van, and just kind of the wheels started spinning a couple weeks back. But this is about accountability, and then measures put in place, call them sanctions if you want, supports, whatever. But the reality is what we actually have the opportunity to do here is to also think about incentivization of the things that actually we believe matter, right? So you could actually weight it and incentivize and add a weight for like number of math candidates who enter the field, number of science candidates enter the field. I mean, personally, I'd love it if we did it for like how many of your people from your EPP end up teaching in like high need schools or communities. Like, there's nothing keeping us from that, and it wouldn't do away with like the things we know are your brass tacks accountability, but it also would incentivize, and it would be an accountability system that not only gets at the brass tacks, but also is actually aimed at what we think like a rigorous, like policy and that's aligned to rigor and also outcomes we know we need. So if I'm going to take on math, and I know that like that puts me at risk with EVOS. But I know, like, I only want to prepare teachers who get great results and, like, meaningful statistical results, then I might say, yeah, but actually I know that I get, like, a statistical benefit from focusing on math and science, and not just taking the path to say, well, I'm going to do arts and English or language arts.
Well, I think it's somewhat a false problem.
Okay.
Because all the state schools
You're
have
constrained.
math, science, English. I mean, they just do, right? And UNCGA is probably not going to, let me speak for them, probably not going to let state schools play that game, right? They're service to the state. Their universities are service to the state. So I don't know of a state school that doesn't have the main core programs. Now, an alternative EPP might come in and say, oh, I'm going to come here and create, I don't know, let's make something up, middle school art teachers, right? And that's all I'm going to do. And that's why the commission could say, no, we don't need that. Like, if you're not going to come here and do a high need area and it's going to make a difference, then we don't approve you, right? I think there's another way to get to the piece. And I also think there's a difference between, and this is going to sound very public-private, but I'm just going to say it, what public universities need to do and what are required, in my opinion, are required to do and should do, and what private universities and colleges are required and can do. So I don't think a private university in North Carolina should be as accountable for the things that you're talking about feeling the need, as a public university that's getting state money. And and this is going to do both.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that private universities don't try to do those things. We produce quite a few math teachers every year for the number of teachers that we produce. We actually produce a high number for the number of teachers that we produce. However, and we try to produce, people in areas that are needed. However, I'm not receiving state money to push programs out that are different and meet all the needs in my region.
With the exceptions of things like teaching fellows, which have an obligation.
Correct. So we do
Right?
it
So when,
because
so
we
when
have
it's incentivized
all
by
of
the
that.
state, right?
Yeah.
I think there's also, the other issue is we're constrained by enrollments and budgets and all these things. And so I don't think you'll get that kind of perverse incentive to create a program because programs are labor intensive, cost intensive, right? And so if most of our costs are in personnel anyway, they would have to hire individual faculty. And if your enrollments don't match the needs, you're just not going to do it. The cost benefit doesn't work out for a campus. The one thing I want us to think about a little bit too, though, is, right, so when we think about accountability, I think we need to focus on the idea of a growth model, right? We're interested in growth. The idea shouldn't be to shut down programs. The idea should be to help programs improve. And then over time, if a program fails to improve, then you shouldn't be in business, right?
Right.
But we want to give people the opportunity to, one, identify their areas of weakness,
Right.
and then
Create a plan.
systematically develop ways in which to improve that program, or decide to shutter the program themselves, right? If you have a very small program and you find that the data just doesn't work for you because you have multiple measures in which you're not performing, perhaps you shouldn't run that program, right?
Right.
So allow programs the opportunity to get better. Now, this doesn't mean indefinitely you don't get years. I think we've established maybe a 3-year timeline, right? You've got 3 years to get your program together, and if you don't, and it's time
Which
to
will
move
also
on.
match with accreditation.
That's right.
I'm
And
sorry, I'm obsessed with accreditation.
No, I think that's important.
Because in accreditation, you have to show continuous improvement, and
Right.
you have to show, you can show a problem and improve on it, that kind of thing.
I want us to be careful though of assigning points because that can lead to rankings, and sometimes these rankings are arbitrary.
So
right?
do we need to do like MET?
So I prefer, there's a criterion, right? We've established a criterion. If it's 70%, if it's 80, whatever it is, you either meet the criterion or you don't.
Yeah,
And we can say, well, you've met 4 out of 6,
Yeah.
and the threshold is you have to
6.
meet 5 out of 6, or
Yeah.
you have to meet 6 out of 6.
I think we do need to give some space.
Yeah. So I
least
just
to
think, I think
begin.
that's how we want to. I worry about I worry
The
about
ranking's
points
a good
system.
point.
A
It's a
ranking,
really good point.
doesn't help.
Because, yes,
If our measures weren't, if they were all objective, and we knew that they were valid and reliable, and right, then I think a ranking is a whole different question, right? But
like I think we could,
we're talking about perception
for-
surveys,
yeah.
and we're talking about a lot of things that there's some play in those numbers. The value add data, there's some play in the value add data. There's some play in the observation data. These aren't hard, fast, purely objective. So, personally, I just prefer this criterion-based system, right? And,
Yeah.
and it's almost the competency model, right? Where you meet the competency or you don't.
well, it's what it is, isn't it?
And so while
Isn't that what we're looking for?
pretty much, and I think where one part of me does agree, right? I want us to think about things like, do candidates work in shortage areas? Are they working in hard-to-staff schools? But I worry a little bit that if we apply any kind of bonus points for doing that kind of work, that's the gaming of the system. Then it becomes, all right,
It's a different game.
because now I can bump my numbers by incentivizing students to
Gotcha.
go work in places that they might not be prepared to work.
I think it's a reportable item. Andrew, I do believe it's totally a reportable item. And I think that then they can use that to do things like incentivize grant money from the state because you're doing this in these districts and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have pots of gold sitting around that we're gonna be giving out.
Yeah.
So,
And I know, Ann, you and I have both said in these meetings, we think about the long game, right? We're not.
it's the long play.
What we do today doesn't necessarily mean we're going to do indefinitely. Like this isn't
right.
in perpetuity, rather, right?
Yeah,
This
I
isn't
would hate
like
for us to start with percentage.
Yeah, but if
I think we could get there maybe.
I think so too.
I know we can get there, but we can't start there.
So what do you mean by that?
So I think that if we get, say like in 5 years or 3 years, we need to evaluate this. Okay, so if we do a 3-year pilot of this, right? And then we find out that it's not delineating anyone, let's just say out. And we know some people need to be out because we're looking at the raw scores. Then we need to come back to what is the model. Maybe our percentage is off. Maybe it needs to go up. Maybe it's 75%, not 70%. But if we're seeing that program X, Y, and Z and program Z they meet 5 of the 6 criteria that we have set out.
Yeah.
However, their EVOS that we are looking at is just continually to be not good at all, then our model's off. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So we need to think about, do we need to change our model because we're not catching people that really should not be producing teachers.
Yep.
So say someone's EVOS data, say everybody took a test like they do in Florida and their EVOS data is at 20% for 3 years in a row. I mean, 20% proficient with students. That place doesn't need to be in business. I'm making it up. I don't know if anybody actually has that or not. So it's just a bizarre example. So hopefully, right?
Yeah.
But if we just say, oh, that's one data point, but you don't have these other data points, so we can't do anything to you, then we need to come back and look at our model to see we need to look at our model versus the raw data.
Yeah.
Well, and depending on what happens with this dashboard, right? So the other problem we have right now is, particularly things like where students are working, that data doesn't come back to us in a clean way.
No.
It's really hard right now to track where your graduates are in the way that we get that data back. And so we need a system that's kind of better identifying where people are, who they are, where they graduated from.
I mean, if I've taken anything away from this commission, which, you know, I think I'm here to think a little differently and to soak up y'all's expertise. I don't have the answers to this. So this is all super helpful. I mean, the one thing I've walked away with is that, like, we have a dark ages data system in a world that has become user driven and data analytics machines can do much better work on this front than human. I mean, it is just crazy that there isn't one data system where I'm somebody who thinks I want to teach, whether that's lateral entry or beginning my career. I load my transcript and my preferences. Something scans it and reads it, spits out to me what I'm capable of. That goes directly to HR directors and districts and to EPPs and to licensure, and everything just goes back in this one system, and a computer makes sure it all kicks out what it needs to get. Not only is it just crazy, and you think about the potential for human error and all the human capacity we spend on that as opposed to figuring out how to design better schools, teach better, it's also like, I worry it's obsolete. I mean, like 5 years from now, your graduates, even now, your graduates are used to, hey, I need a lift. Boom, it comes and finds me. Hey, I want a mortgage. Boom, Rocket Mortgage. It comes and finds me. Nobody's going to do any of this stuff 5 years from now. And education is going to be the last mantle of, like, trying to figure this out. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox other than to say, I don't know what it would cost, but we should figure out how to do it and spend it. And it would make everybody's lives easier, and the data would be cleaner from the get-go. But then the only other thought I'm having with this is all super helpful, is how do we, so this piece around the things that aren't here, these are our basic measures of accountability. By law, they feel right. I don't know, take or leave some of the stuff we see from other states. What about the things that aren't? And part of this is playing devil's advocate and pushing the thinking.
Go ahead,
but like,
Andrew.
So I think there's two things I've been thinking a lot about as we've dug into this. One, my mindset from the get-go was like accountability. How do we shut down the ones that aren't working? And I think I've started to flip the paradigm and say, like, oh, accountability models could be to shut down the ones that aren't working, or they can actually be to incentivize like risk-taking and innovation and spread best practice. I'm in that camp now. I don't know what to do with that. But I'm like, I don't want to like take, you know, and this isn't a knock. I mean, I also have a sense of who is doing pretty good work based on my interactions with you all on the commission. But I want us to like not be like, okay, let's settle for this and then figure out who we need to shut down. But like, how does this model and what we're looking at actually drive actions, leadership, innovation towards what needs to come next based upon what we're seeing in the state, right? And to your point, and thank you for that, because I wasn't even thinking about the fact that like private universities, you know, it's part of your model to send people to Pennsylvania or Georgia or wherever else.
Internationally.
But
also a lot in North Carolina. I mean, we place a lot of teachers in North Carolina, more every year.
Yeah, but so one is this paradigm shift of like, how does it actually fuel learning and innovation and best practice is just one thing I'm sitting with a lot. And then the other is, you know, there are some things that I think a state-of-the-art, forward-looking model of accountability would factor in. You know, some of them for me are just, you know, I have a bias, right? Like I think we have a terribly inequitable education system, not because anybody's bad actors, but because like, you know, we don't actually think about systems change at the equity level.
Well, we don't incentivize students, right? So we incentivize students to work in larger urban districts through local supplement, right? Through salary, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and so you know, you could right now there's a political narrative of like it's this or it's that, but I think if you zoom out and you take a systems level approach, like, oh yeah, well that's actually what our systems all point to. If I'm a recent graduate from a school of ed, every measure or every indicator is flashing at me that I should go teach, you know, Wake County or Guilford County. Nothing, literally nothing in our system is saying, but you're actually needed in Bethel, North Carolina.
Yeah. So there are small scale pieces, right? So teaching fellows is one.
Yep.
Right, because your
2 to 1 versus 1 to 1.
payback is 2 to 1.
Yep. Okay.
Work.
Great.
Performance on the TPA, because if you're a higher performing and you
48
plus
Top
the
10%.
GPA, and then you work in a high need subject,
Yep.
right? That incentivizes. So there are small incentives. There aren't enough right now. So I agree. I totally agree with everything you're saying. The incentives right now are too small to overcome the bigger system, the bigger complex system problem we have. With regard to the question about innovation, right, which I think is a really important one too, is how do we incentivize innovation amongst teacher prep programs across the state, and whether or not these measures do that. I'm not sure if they do, with the exception of maybe EdTPA, EPAT, right? But EdTPA in particular, because what's happened is when we instituted EdTPA as a performance measure and as a licensing requirement, we saw far more collaboration between teacher prep programs throughout North Carolina in preparing students to work towards that. And so now we've got this kind of common language, common framework around pedagogical practice, right, and language, right? So I think that's one of the pieces. Now, does EVOS do that? No, EVOS doesn't do that. I think some of these other measures don't. So I think your question is well stated, right? So how do we, and I don't know, is that even a function of our work? Is it our business to try to incentivize innovation in teacher prep programs, or is that?
But don't you think it's a tier 2? So like if we say these are the outcomes, and then and we're going to have a dashboard, right? And everybody's going to be on it, right? So teaching fellows, the reinstatement, as they call it, of teaching fellows was the first, in my opinion, this is Ann, was the first time that they actually went for quality and not regional or other factors.
It was purely based on these data points right here.
Based on data. So if then we start to highlight these data points that are beyond, which are facts, right? So here, like, Teach for America in Eastern North Carolina. Teach for America Eastern North Carolina met all their outcome measures. Plus, they did this, and this. They had this many students. They had this many percentage in high need schools. They had this many percentage here. I think we can push that piece toward money. So if you look at people have done things like NELA, the money went to NELA. They finally took principal fellows and said, we're just going to give you all of it, NC State, because look what you're doing over here.
Well, it's NC State plus partners.
Yes, but the headquarters.
Yes.
So, right, not just for NC State graduates, but they're like, you've created an effective model, right? So I see the money following some of these factors like it did with teaching fellows. So, and the facts are what's going to go with the bills and with the policy. I've seen it over and over. If you present anything to legislators, they want to know, they want to come see me, for example, because they want to know what we're doing, which makes us so good.
And this is the starting point for you.
Because they're reading these
I think some of this is a campus-based issue, right? Like building the narrative around effective teacher preparation to some degree is a campus issue. And whether or not that particular program does, they can start with this data, but I think the dashboard has to be more inclusive.
Yes, me too.
And include other data, right?
Yeah.
Including things like hard to staff schools,
Absolutely.
including high license
How many
areas.
percentage of
And then as a
hard to staff
campus, you're able to
areas.
sit back and say,
Oh.
look, my performance data is great, but not only is my performance data great, look at all the other amazing things that I do here, right, in this state. And then for some campuses, they can say, well, most of our performance data is great, but here's a service that we provide because, right, while this data is
we produce the
5
most
out of
minority
6,
teachers in the
we,
state.
or we are serving hard to staff schools in Eastern North Carolina.
Yeah.
We are, right, so they're able to build their own case around what their program is, but we're essentially holding feet to the fire, for lack of a better word, around the performance indicators that we actually have data on.
Okay.
And maybe maybe Michael and I are stuck in some century that we need to be,
Yeah,
you
man,
know, like
I'm open to other,
Yeah.
I'm certainly open.
But I do agree that the dashboard needs to be broader than these whatever number of indicator outcomes that we come up. And I think that those are questions that people ask, right? Because those are all issues that we have in the teaching force in North Carolina. And part of the long play is for everybody, private and public, to be like, okay, can we get people to stay in our area, wherever that is? I mean,
And it has to be over things that we can control.
yeah.
So I think that's the other piece that I'm always concerned about, right? So I can't control where a student goes to work, ultimately. I can't even control what
diversity of
major they
placement.
take, right? So we hear that a lot, right? Like, why don't you prepare more teachers in special education? That'd be great. I don't have a line of them outside my door, right? we recruit, we do all the other things we have to do, but it's not like there's a population of undergraduates out there that that we say like, no, don't come here. So I want to be held accountable for things that I absolutely have control over. And it's not that I don't want to be accountable for these other things. I want them reported, and I think that's important. I think transparency is important. But it's hard to be sanctioned over something that I can't control. And I think that's what people fear in the teacher prep community, right? They fear being sanctioned over something they have no control over. So if we're looking for measures to add,
Can I push on that a little
yeah,
bit?
absolutely.
It's helpful. This is super helpful. But not to get like metaphysical, because I mean technically we don't have control over much, right? Like, but
Yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking about that though is that through prioritization and resources, we probably have more control over things than we think we don't have, right? So we can't force anybody to choose special education.
Yep.
But
But
they're in teaching fellows.
Unless
So
they're in
people-
teaching fellows.
yeah, or
Right,
a
so-
university could say, actually, we see this need. We think we've got a model that can prepare people for this and get them into this type of role, special ed
Mhm.
example, EC. And so we're gonna like design a program around that. And we're gonna go like actively recruit folks.
Yep.
Here's
so,
why.
So I'll give you two examples. So I have two good examples for you this year. So we actually we just built a special education undergraduate add-on because NC State didn't have a special education program, right?
Okay.
For that purpose, right? That's going to couple with our elementary ed program for this explicit purpose of trying to serve a need in North Carolina. Second example is, so we've been running something called the TIP Scholars for 2 years now, where we're working with 6 rural partners, and we've got some of our student teachers are doing their student teaching in these districts. They're incentivized to work there. The district is actually giving them kind of a salary stipend as part of that. So these are programs that we have tried to put in place to do the very things that you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Hard to staff subjects and hard to staff schools.
Yep.
Right? But those are unique things that we've done at NC State in collaboration with a partner. And so on these measures, I would be able to say, yeah, as an individual, I'd say, great, let's do that because my campus is going to look really good because I'm putting innovations in place to try to handle this. But I would be holding smaller campuses and I would be holding other campuses to a standard that they can't necessarily meet.
Right. Andrew, I don't know if you know, there are private universities and colleges in North Carolina that produce like 2 to 3 teaching candidates
Yes.
a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And reviewing things.
And so yeah, and you also can't put stipulations on tuition-driven campuses that you can on state schools. So by having a combined dashboard, that's a great thing for North Carolina, but by having a combined dashboard, you're not only living in the state world anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm here today.
I do think in looking at some of these, some of the other pieces here that states have, I mean, I certainly like retention rate, one year retention rate.
Who does that one?
I think that's a Florida one as well.
Yeah.
Well, they just say retention rate. Personally, I'm in favor of a 1 year retention rate. So from first, how many teachers go from the first year to the second year from your campus? I would like to stay
Anybody
away
have,
from.
anything?
I would like to stay away from some of these like input metrics, SAT scores, GPAs. I
I'd
don't
like for
think
us
that
to
helps.
like
I think SAT scores, GPAs.
take that out. Yeah, that's what he said.
I don't like
It's
any
not
of those
outcome
things.
measure.
Those
I mean, for the sake of argument.
they're
and
going to be on the dashboard, but I don't know that it's a
It can be
Might just be too it might just be too ingrained in my Teach for America brain. These are the kind of things I probably shouldn't say publicly on record, but I mean, I don't know that they're the right input measures, but I do absolutely believe in like diverse talent. And will tell you the reason Teach for America gets the result it gets isn't because we found some great programmatic. It's because we go out and recruit people who are pretty phenomenal and otherwise
Right.
wouldn't be in education. And like, the thing about phenomenal leaders at a young age is they figure things out faster than other people. And so there is an element of, if we know we've got both a talent shortage and the next 50 years are going to be redesigning schools because the schools we have aren't the ones that our students need and the economy is going to need. I actually do think a bet on talent is one thing that we don't talk enough about as a state, right? And so there is something about both the diversity of your applicant or candidate pool and the qualifications. I mean, I don't know if it was Florida or somebody in here named those two, and those jumped for me. But I say that, and I'm in agreement that some of the baseline stuff we use, I don't think actually gets at that.
Yeah.
I just think it's low-hanging fruit. And it's like, oh, yeah, easy to measure,
And
the thing we've all talked
campuses are recording their, right now that you have a 2.7 required anyway, right? And you've got cohort 3.0. Everybody's doing that already for accreditation. But I'm not sure
my
that-
question would be, do you raise the bar? So, like, Teach for America's average GPA is 3.7, and we're the largest provider
that's
of
post-bac.
teachers of color.
Remember, that's post-bac,
Yep, sorry. Not high
right? So
school.
we're not talking
Yep.
post-bac now, we're talking about
Yep.
sophomores.
Yep.
And so do we want to limit the pipe of kids coming in because they had a bad, so my argument
Gotcha.
would be,
Yep.
I've got kids who come, who spend a year in engineering at NC State,
Yep,
and then they realize they didn't really want to be an engineer, and they actually want to teach math.
yep.
And then I would argue, if you look at the performance outcomes for my college in math, it's pretty good.
Very good.
And I've got a number of kids who started out with pretty low GPAs because they transferred out of a major they didn't like.
Found something they liked.
And they found something they were both good at and enjoyed. So we have to think about and then the outcome. If you look at GPAs as an outcome measure, you're going to run into kind of grade inflation arguments, right? Like college of education
There-
high GPAs
yeah.
anyway.
The other thing is that the 2+2 programs, and they don't require the SAT if you transfer with the AA from the community college.
Yeah.
Yep. When with the increase in early colleges,
Y'all wouldn't.
that's gonna that.
I mean, they start at the community college and they're already
Right.
enrolled in
they-
NC
and they
State
just
from
enroll.
certain community colleges. They enrolled at UNCG and certain community colleges.
Yeah.
So it's not gonna be a common factor.
Yeah, so I think if we had a way to open it up, right, to where you get a more diverse talent pool, you can really hold programs accountable at the back end, right? Because it was their choice in terms of who they brought into their college.
Yep.
And so,
I don't know how you capture the talent piece.
No, that's actually what you've uncovered for me. It's the things that I thought would be like the easiest measure. I'm like, oh, actually, those don't get out.
yeah, and I think in
I
a
mean,
different.
I would love to capture talent.
Well,
I
if
think
we were
talent
if
is
we
an
were in a
issue.
shortage state, right? If we were a surplus state, it'd be a different story.
Yeah, that's right.
If we were a teacher surplus state, we could do a whole lot of things differently.
Yeah.
But you know, like, I mean, we measure a lot of dispositions throughout our program, like a lot. Like I'm gathering those today in my absence. And that's not an outcome measure, but you do not. We do.
A little bit, not.
Yeah, I think we do it, well, tier 1 data, we do it like several times.
We do the minimum for accreditation. We don't.
Y'all are minimalistic, I know.
What's your demographic in your schools of ed? Demographic.
White
data?
women.
Yeah, I mean, how many? What's your ballpark?
We're slightly
Percentage.
better than the national average. About 84% of my students are white. 16%. And if you look at the national number for teacher preparation, it's 88% white.
Yeah.
So we're slightly better
We're
than the
bad.
national.
This is the first year we're predominantly teachers of color nationally.
Now, if you look at our alternative licensure programs, they're very different demographic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So second career folks, we tend to have way more teachers of color coming into our alternative licensure programs than we do to our, and I think that too, you have to look at that as an artifact. So my college has more, has more students of color by percentage than the university as a whole. Right? So I think you have to,
Wow.
you
We
have
match
to,
our
you have to balance
university.
that too, right? I mean, I can't have 60% of my students in my college being teachers of color if the university only has 14% or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
Because then what we're doing, yeah.
I'd say the alternative programs in general bring in way more
Mhm.
individuals of all the intercultural competency areas, actually, or just the whole ring. Just because it's a second career, yeah, we're
This
right.
is
We're
where-
about like
I
them.
mean, this is where, you know, and I know you all think about this, and we need to do much more as a state in each of our institutions, especially with what we're seeing research-wise about like the impact that, you know, teachers of color have, the additional impact. I mean, this is also where you can't separate. You've got to take a systems lens, right? like those numbers don't just happen. You know, I'll take you on a trip to any of our counties in eastern North Carolina, and I'll show you exactly why your numbers at NC State look like they look.
Yeah.
Because we give up on kids, I mean, really from the time they're born. But particularly, you know, this isn't a problem that we can solve in this room, but this is where I'm like, there is something about setting, and I'm overreaching here, probably in like an Arnie Duncan, President Obama kind of way, to be like, oh, what can we incentivize and drive all the accountability through that? So I appreciate the push, but there is like, you know, we don't have anywhere named like the demographics are actually going to play in. I think we should, knowing what we know about diversity. Kentucky has it listed as number 1, right? They measure candidate demographics. And this goes back to the gentle, loving push I gave about what you control is like, sure, everybody say, well, I can't control because I can, and I'm like, no, I just don't buy that. Like, when we put our resources to new problems or priorities, people do change.
So here's one of the challenges, right? I'm kind of loath to say this, but here's kind of the reality of it. If I'm a non-education major at NC State,
Yep.
I'm a math major, science major, and engineering major, my average starting salary is anywhere between $55,000 and $70,000 first year out. For those majors.
Yep.
Education major salary is $36,000. So essentially, in essence, what I'm doing is telling high-performing students who've been admitted to NC State, hey, why don't you forego an extra $15,000 a year and come be a teacher?
Yep.
When they didn't choose to become a teacher in the first place.
Yep.
You see that? So to me, that's almost a moral conundrum, right? Is that I take these students who are high-performing and I say, hey,
no,
because you're a teacher of color, why don't you come to education because we really need you, right? So that's one of the struggles that and believe me, I mean, we work really hard to recruit underrepresented students. So our elementary program, we target men, both white and men of color, right? Because we need more men in elementary education, right? We're very specific about our target. So we are specifically recruiting, and we have programs in the college to try to recruit, particularly men of color, right? Teachers of color in general. But there's only so much you can do in the absence of other incentives like salary is a big one for us.
Oh yeah, I mean, we're running the same challenge.
And that's a
first
big one, right?
generation. We've seen an uptick in first generation, a significant uptick
We have-
through intentional efforts of teachers of color. And one of the first questions is,
And 60%
I'm
of
a first generation
60% of my
college
students are on need-based financial aid in teacher education, right? So we're going to take 60% of our kids are on financial aid, and now we're going to give them a salary that's $14,000 or more less than they would have made. These kids have been admitted to the university, not the college. So they got into NC State, right? So they didn't, and I want to dispel that myth too, right? That this idea that people become teachers because they can't get into other majors, right? That's not true at all, right? They're admitted to the university. They can do anything they want within that university. They choose to become teachers.
Yep.
Right? So I think there are lots of pieces. There are lots of moving parts that.
I mean, my question.
I do agree with you, though.
Yeah,
Don't get me wrong.
no, and this resonates. I mean, my question on that front. So actually, there's two things that are surfacing for me as we talk through this, and I don't know who's on the phone with us, but would love to hear their thoughts too. I mean, one is,
Go ahead.
you know, the larger state or even larger public IHEs who are doing this work are one group, and then you've got smaller groups, and then you've got non-traditional groups, which
That's right.
Senate Bill 599 opens up, right? Like it's only a matter of time before Relay starts operating in North Carolina, and you know whatever the one is, I'll see on the TV with the owls.
It's already here.
They're already here.
They're already here. See, well,
And they're backdooring their way to licenses
so you know this
because they're licensed out in Colorado.
part of what
They
I'm
do reciprocal.
interested in here is like, you know, and I think at the level we're supposed to be at is like, this all makes sense, and I know you all are tackling this, but what are we measuring that really is, and I think this gets back to your point about like, what are the things that are just non-negotiable, that are the baseline, not necessarily tier 2 innovation, and, you know, including alternative licensure programs because they become EPPs under the law.
That's right.
Yep.
If we want to operate the way we have been operating, we've got to apply and be named an EPP.
Welcome, Dan.
That is the only piece I'm still trying to wrap my head around is, maybe the question is, if these are the things we're measuring, it sounds like a couple we should keep exploring. How does that play out? How does that play out for all these other groups that now
Yeah.
will be included in the EPP bucket and have to meet the same rigorous bar that honestly you all have
Yeah.
been trying to
But
meet?
all of these are, the five that we've mentioned, 5 or 6, are all things that everybody will have to do for licensure anyway.
Right.
Yep.
Not anyway, but you'll have to do the Ed TPA, you have
Yeah.
to do.
I think
So that's the
regardless
only
of who
one.
you are, regardless of who you are, these 6 things hold true for
Turn
everybody,
it off.
regardless of pathway.
Yep.
Right? We can collect this data, these 6 points
Any
we can
route.
collect on every route.
Yep.
I think it's a really important question.
And that includes like the Guilford County program, it includes the Central Carolina Resource Program. I think I'll mention again, I am in favor of the retention rate. I do think 1-year retention rate is a good indicator of preparation.
So,
But other than
Oh.
that, I'm not sure.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it reminded me of a question I had that got buried in our back and forth. So when we were, when you rightfully mentioned, GPA, SAT, we're talking about freshman into sophomore year.
Yep.
But when we do start talking about, Western Governors or Andrews School for Teachers down the road, those folks aren't actually, sophomores at NC State
Right.
who've had to get in. There does seem to need to be something in place. So that
So-
the Andrews School of Teachers
So,
isn't just
so
bringing
if
you everybody
if
who's
you're
looking
earning
for
a
work.
bachelor's degree, if you're earning a degree, then you meet the 2.7 GPA requirement that the state has put into law,
Okay.
right? So the entrance requirements, and you have to do the pre-professional skills test, so practice core or be exempt, right, 3 years. So they're doing the same entrance requirements. Where it breaks down is if you are, the recently approved Teachers for Tomorrow.
Yeah.
If you have a degree already,
right.
that's when you're able to be exempt. So like your folks, right,
Gotcha.
are exempt from the praxis core because they have a bachelor's degree.
Right, and while they would probably have, most of them would probably have SAT scores if they went to certain Ivy, they may not. But let's just say somebody went through a community college and graduated from NC State.
Yep.
And then they go somewhere else and then decide to be a teacher. They would never have an SAT.
They'd never have an
They
SAT.
could never have an SAT or a Practice 1 score because they had a
Sure,
high
sure.
enough
As
GPA
long as they had a
coming out.
2.7 GPA.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
And a degree.
So it's not going to be a common indicator.
Gotcha.
It's going to be super messy.
Yeah, but if I'm reading this right, by the law, we have to include that one. I'm going back to the original one we started talking about, the cross-state comparison and the ones that are required by law.
It's not required in the residency license, is it?
I don't know.
I'm asking the question.
And I'm asking now for my own clarification.
That's a
It's
good
the-
question. That we need clarification on, Kim.
Kim, it's the accountability cross-state comparison version 1. I think it's the other Excel sheet. Sorry. Yeah, that one. So the 5 X's.
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
2.7 and
We're all
so
required
I think the
by law.
2.7 and the 3.0, right, in terms of accountability, this is a yes no versus a attaching points or
Okay.
criteria to it, right? Because you have to meet it for accreditation.
Either meet it or you don't.
Yeah. So and this is just my opinion, right? You can certainly say take your opinion and go buy a cup of coffee with it.
Even in residency license?
But I feel like if we put some teeth to the things that we can measure, and then we just have the others as check boxes, like, do you meet the 2.730? Check, right? And then right?
But like, what about this average score on
That's the same.
pre-professional skills?
Yes, that's the same thing. We can list it, but we don't do anything with it. So we include it. I don't know what you do with it. The average score. This is a measure that doesn't make any sense, right? Because there's a cut
Yeah,
score.
When I was reading it, I was like,
There's a cut score, and so. Yeah, and then it's going to be the average the average SAT score. So
I mean,
here's where you're going to
Your
run into-
cohort's going to come out really well on this, Andrew, on the average SAT
right. So
score.
yeah, my
well,
college going
and
to
that's
do
part of
great
where
on the
this
average
question
SAT
came
score.
from, and not to be a hardliner, but I know we look for talent, and there's different things we measure, and from years of working with us on
Yeah,
the board.
sure.
But like at the end of the day, I care if our people are getting results or not.
That's right.
Like I don't care. I don't care about that stuff other than to get you in the door. And then what I would want to be held accountable on is like our kids learning in
Yeah.
that classroom.
Yeah, yeah.
And does the teacher,
Have,
does their evaluation from their employer
are all those pieces
show?
lining up?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Do the employers that hire our people on a survey say, like, Teach for America is a huge talent source for us. We're happy with the folks we get because they benefit in blah, blah, blah ways.
Yeah.
All outcomes based, right? Like some perception,
Yeah,
outcomes based. But I also think like this is
All
where,
at the end, not the beginning.
yeah, and if you look at our systems, right? I mean, this
Yeah.
is where if we really live into what we have and we trust principles with hiring and firing, then you get
And
to a
I've become
different
an
thing.
all at the end guy.
Me, yeah,
I don't
I'm
care
all-
about all this entrance stuff. I only care about the outcome data.
I mean, again, it might be something we report because it's on the dashboard
But you have to
because
report.
it's state law, but it may not be something that we,
like we could weight it really low
yeah.
if we do the weights, if that's the,
What the
the
grade
route.
average?
No, not the grade point average. The,
I mean, what you could say,
Where
one of
is
the
it?
ways, if we went to this kind of criterion-based system where it's kind of a you meet or you don't meet,
Yeah,
you could, so the first one could be, is the average GPA 2.7 or better?
yeah,
it could be that,
Yes or no?
yes or no, yeah.
And then are your pre-professional skills tests, is the average at the cut score or
Where
above,
is that?
right?
Like a pre-checklist?
It's the core,
I
it's
mean,
the
this
praxis
is where
core.
this is
No,
where
it's,
this
but
is-
that's like kind of like a pre-checklist. Those are just, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically a, it's not weighted
it's all
or,
the same.
or it's weighted. So here's what's gonna happen with this, right? With those two measures. If we go to a weighting system, the places that are gonna distinguish campuses are gonna be the value add score, maybe the survey results.
Yeah, maybe.
You're gonna see,
Not the teacher evals.
and maybe on the licensure pass rate in some instances, and on the,
Yeah. You'll see a correlation between SAT scores and licensure pass rates.
and the TPA you might see, but you're not
Gary
gonna see
Henry.
you're not gonna see much, differentiation on the value add scores.
yeah.
It's not a big differentiator, as we saw when we did the teaching fellows applications. The value add scores are actually a far smaller differentiator amongst campuses than you might think.
Privates don't even get theirs yet. I said yet.
Okay.
So the big
Yeah, because that's
differentiator.
what stood out to me when I saw this. I mean, I had the same thought about. I mean, I'm an outcomes guy.
Yep.
Really, outcomes more than output sometimes. But I
Mhm.
was like looking at this, I'm like, oh man. According to the group that we sampled, they do think that's a worthwhile thing to be. You know, if you look at the 3.29 up there, right?
Yep.
Like, and you look across the board, people agree or strongly agree with a couple of disagrees. And then I saw the low on
But don't you think
EVAS.
that's because they know they have to have it for accreditation?
I don't know.
I mean, I don't want to,
Well,
but you know, like it's
I mean,
it's a
I c-
given.
I would have rated
accreditation.
I would have rated low just because it's a meaningless number.
Yeah.
It's meaningless.
I mean, if you, yeah, that is how
I don't know what to
I would
do.
want everybody to answer based on what they actually thought would be helpful. in
And
preparing
I'm
better
making
teacher
an
candidates,
assumption,
not
but
what is
I mean, it's what
required
we,
by
it's the world
accreditation.
in which we live in accreditation.
Oh, I understand. I mean,
Yeah.
I hear you. I
Yeah.
just may think this is like an underlying just leadership challenge. Generally.
Now, I do also think, so I know we don't want to get into process, but I do think it's important that we're thinking about process and at the same time we're thinking about this. And this subcommittee should be looking at data for all of these campuses unblinded, regardless of the end,
And see what we got.
and see what's happening. I'm going to beat that drum every time I get a chance to. You should not get to hide behind a low end. Now, that shouldn't be publicly available. I'm not in favor of, on a dashboard, you've got two graduates, and we know which one passed and which one didn't
No,
pass.
yeah, because that's
You have a 50%
identifiable.
pass. We don't need to know that. That can be asterisk.
Well, that's
I'm
FERPA.
perfectly fine with that. And we can capture 10 years of data. We can set an end and roll it until we get 10. I'm perfectly happy with that. But this subcommittee needs to see the data
Yeah.
unblinded, because
That's
if a campus has two completers and they have a 0% pass rate on a licensure exam, that's a problem.
Or if they have one student that's taken it 8 times,
That's a problem.
because those are outliers.
And so that's what I think is, as we think about these measures, that the subcommittee should be able to see what's happening
Yeah.
in that program and then make the kinds of recommendations that need to be made
Well,
for improvement.
and Andrew and Kim have offered to like run, don't let me offer something that I think you offered this, to run models on this. Like we play around with the weights and we look at the things, we can kind of say, oh yeah, let's see how this would play out. And then you can look at the data and say,
Right.
oh yeah, it plays out like
'Cause-
maybe it should.
Because even in the dashboard bill, in that MK9 bill, there's like the
Are
small
you summoned?
program exemption or something, which I am not in favor of.
I'm not either. I don't know that that sits with the subcommittee. Maybe it does.
And it's
But
kind of
purview
it's
should be
hiding
pushed.
low performing potentially.
What?
In that MK9, that dashboard
Oh,
bill.
I have
the-
not read
the-
that.
The low enrollment or low small program exemption or something. Again, that's just another thing, and I know if people are listening to this, they're gonna be mad at me, I'm gonna get ugly emails about this, but I'm not in favor of that.
Well, this is Andrew. I came over because I know we're live, so I just want to make sure I can hear. So, Andrew, you mentioned, can we do that? Yes, we can. I suppose a question for the subcommittee is, what would you like us to run? Are you asking for us to look at pass rates of all institutions, regardless of N, over the past 3 years, over the past 5 years? How would you like for me to cut that deck? Because I can do it. I just don't know exactly what
Yeah.
data you're inquiring about. So that's one thing. And the second thing is the small group exemption for the MK1.
MK9, yeah.
Yeah, my interpretation of that reading was that some of what is cooked in there is the notion of looking at data over multiple years, which renders the idea of the exception somewhat moot, right? So, in other words, I'm an institute. Andrew University creates, 2 graduates a year. Okay, so that's well below a sample size that we'd feel comfortable with. And so we go back 3 years, and now Andrew has a graduate rate of 6, and now I'm in a safe area to actually talk about. And that's something that I know, Dr. Marr, you and I have been talking about for years. Because my fear is not the big guys. The big guys have lots of transparency, even down to individual program levels. My fear is the little guys that fall under the radar. We're going to try and help them be better. So, any thoughts towards how you want us to cut the deck? And the answer could be, this time around we'll do it this way, and when we look at it, we see data that may help us think
So
about it.
3 years of licensure data would be in line with accreditation expectation. 3 cycles
Yeah, I think 3 years.
of data.
3 cycles or 3 years.
Mhm.
Yours runs by years.
If you need 5 in order to get an N for small programs, I don't have a problem with that.
Do you want that disag at the program level?
Yes, please. That's the world in which we live.
Yeah, I think people appreciate the disag at the program level,
That's why
just
they
because
need
you, even from a program's
How we need it.
perspective, right? You want to be able to differentiate.
Another like hypothetical challenge I could see coming up, bringing it back to like the diversity demographic question, and you said something that triggered this thought for me, that if you look at SAT score, it usually correlates with EdTPA.
Gary Henry.
Yeah, and if you also look at any
No,
research,
if you look at SAT score, licensure test pass rates.
licensure test pass, sorry. But if you also look at like standardized test bias, and we
Yep.
see this play on our own core, incredible people who do not struggle at all to
Right.
teach and lead students to remarkable outcomes cannot pass that damn test.
Yeah.
So there is a part of me that thinks if you don't include some measure, and this gets to the fundamental question of what we can and can't control.
Mhm.
And I think we have a slightly higher locus, but we should grab coffee and talk about that sometime. I think you could run a risk if you don't include any demographic data or diversity of your candidate pool, that like you could have a really strong EdTPA score, and one of the mechanisms or levers you might pull to get a really strong EdTPA score is to not have people in your program who through educational inequity, standardized test bias, whatever it is, you could project with data that they're not going to be able to pass that test. That to me, this gets back to this question of like what we set up as accountability structure. Does it create perverse loopholes that aren't actually aligned ethically and morally with what we need? But now I'd say like the research on needing the most diverse teacher pool possible that matches your student pool, right?
So what would you set as the metric for that?
I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious for a couple of these states that actually have it, if we followed up with them and asked how they measure it, and just see what works for them and what doesn't, or explore.
I think Weddington had a note in there, or Lenore Ryan, somebody had a note in there about issues.
Same person.
Yeah, it was in there on the notes of.
What other measures should be added to the list?
Yeah, did you guys catch that in there?
I didn't. That one didn't stick out to me. But.
Now, I would, perhaps perhaps the measure is related to the diversity of your campus at large. But then you run the problem of programs not on a campus.
Yeah.
What's their comparator?
Yeah, I don't know that I compare. Well, maybe you could. I don't know. That'd be interesting. I mean, I think, if I could wave a magic wand, it'd probably be something about the diversification of your candidate pool and like what you're comparing it to. Body at large, state at large, right? Student population at large. I don't know. I think the way you could hold EPPs accountable is that there's no gap in performance or test passage along lines of difference. If I'm a candidate of color in your program at NC State.
So can you disaggregate the licensure pass rates and the EdTPA scores?
By gender?
By ethnicity.
I just think if you don't start, look, I get that this is also a little, it's the direction we need to head in, and more folks are talking about equity, particularly racial equity. We're not fully there yet as a society or a state, but it's like, I believe fully we need to be heading that direction. Because otherwise you set up policies and accountability programs that aren't even taking that into account.
599 actually requires us to disag by race, gender, and ethnicity on everything. And I actually, there's a logistical disaster afoot there. When you start thinking about disagging by those criteria at the program level, everything's going to be down below.
You're not going to be able to share any data.
You're going to have to look over multiple years again. But the point is, it is the intent of the lawmakers to make sure that is a part of the calculation. And how that gets cooked is, I haven't figured that out yet, but know that that's in there. I did want to draw your attention on the overhead here. Let me read this one. Can you go back to the left, I think it is?
The long one?
Yeah, this long one. So this is coming from Lenore Ryan, who's one of the pieces of feedback. I'm going to read it out loud so in case there's folks on the call that can't see it. A key missing piece of data which should be considered. We are not measuring pre-service candidate growth from college entry to licensure completion. For example, if an institution admits a significant percentage of students falling into one of the following categories: Pell eligible, first generation college, underrepresented population, average or below ACT, SAT scores, required developmental math or English courses, etc., and is able to strategically serve this population of students in a way that supports and enables them to gain admission to the EPP and successfully complete state-approved licensure requirements, then can there be a metric which captures this? My contention is that the measures we use to judge EPPs ought to be contextualized within the broader picture of the student population we serve. This is not to decrease accountability or provide a means for excusing performance. It's a way to recognize the student growth that the IHE and EPP supports across a student's college career. If 90% of one IHE students are required to complete the Praxis Core exams for admission to the EPP, while another IHE can waive this requirement for 90% of their students based on SAT or ACT scores, then research would predict that students from the second IHE would likely perform better on standardized assessments in general. including standardized licensure assessments. This is not just one hypothetical example, but I think it's important that we not only recognize the standardized set of outcomes for EPPs, but also, I lost my place, EPPs, I don't know where I'm at.
Right where the cursor is, standardized licensure assessments. This is just one hypothetical example.
Yeah, this is just one hypothetical example, but I think it is important that we not only recognize the standardized set of outcomes for EPPs, but also provide, no, I'm really lost.
Sorry.
Third line from the bottom. I think.
Also recognize a standardized set of outcomes for EPPs, but also provide some way to differentiate the growth paths that EPPs must support in order for their candidates to meet these standardized outcomes. I just thought of all the feedback that was in there as we were collecting it, that one rang true to me, and it sounds like it's relevant to the discussion at hand. I just wanted to draw people's attention to it.
Andrew, this is Van. If I can chime in, that same issue about context came up in the EPP subcommittee, except on the back end that if the EPP is producing a number of students who go into what might be called hard to staff, hard to teach, schools that face sets of challenges, how do you contextualize things like retention, where the district may not have the resources to support retention as compared to a district that does have those resources, but the EPP is being held accountable for retention.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge we're running into here, and this is illuminating because I think I was thinking about it way too simplistically, is that there's really two things we're talking about here and trying to either set up an accountability system for, or at least just measure. And one is like the diversification of who you recruit, accept, and prepare. And then two, how effective they are when they come out of your program. Which could have, I mean, to Van, your point, could have wide-ranging effects on many issues. Who we partner with in terms of where they go teach, how long they stay. I mean, yeah.
And how you set up the accountability model implicitly drives people to or away from those very things that you may be intending to try to staff, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why when we start with these kind of 6 things, they're the 6 things that we can control. Or at least things that we claim we can control, right? Whether or not you are evaluated, whether or not you achieve appropriate evaluations by your principal is to some degree a reflection of how well you were prepared. Either you were prepared to teach or you weren't. Your Ed TPA is a really good measure of how well you were prepared to plan, instruct, and assess, right? To do those 3 primary things. Licensure exam pass rates are going to be an important differentiator, right? It's one of the places that we are going to see some differentiation amongst campuses. And now that we've recommended a change in the licensure exam for elementary ed, that's been the big one.
Yep.
Because if you look at the PLT and content pass rates, most campuses are well over 90%. Right? So you're not going to see a whole lot of differentiation amongst campuses on the general content. But I think this, as long as we can leave this open to where as new measures become available, as our data system becomes more refined, that we're able to build in new pieces. That makes sense, right? Because I think we're also confined a little bit by the data system.
All right. What other problems of the world do we need to solve today?
All right, so coming back to this, because I know we talked about earlier, but so we took the teaching fellows example and the ATPA one you mentioned around 2-for-1.
Yeah, incentivizes.
It's an incentivization with an equity lens, right? Like,
Yeah.
it may not be equal, but it's targeted at where
Yep.
meeting the greatest need. Or am I mean, and please push me on this. Am I like an activist
Yes.
subcommittee member here where I'm like, oh great, we can do that here. We can actually add an equity lens to all of this. Doesn't have to be a big weight, but it's a weight. It says, no, this actually matters. And we are going to say it matters so much so that like there's an incentivization with it, but it doesn't take away that there's some other measures that we know are fundamental and critical across the board. In the spirit of the way Teaching Fellows is set up, can that work its way into what we hold programs accountable for? And what I'm hearing is there's like a control piece. What do we actually control? And are we going to set up a system that like sanctions people for a thing that they can't control? To the small colleges or really small programs.
So we've got some small colleges in Western North Carolina that have less than 10 candidates.
Brevard, I think.
Brevard has 6.
Some people.
4 of them go to Tennessee to work.
Yep.
2 of them stay in North Carolina.
Yep.
Why?
Yeah. It's a good case study.
So what do I do with that, right? Like, and if they go and they work in a virtually all white school.
Yep.
So you see the challenge.
Well, but
right?
even then in Western North Carolina, you probably would be looking a lot at socioeconomic, right? I mean, you'd look at class as your diversification as opposed to race or ethnicity. Yeah.
So you see the challenge, right?
Yeah,
We've got
yeah.
51. You've got 51 teacher prep programs. We've approved Teachers of Tomorrow. You've got Guilford County Schools. You've got Charlotte Meck Schools. You've got Central Carolina RESA. You've got our Pathway to Practice. So you got another 5 non-IHE EPPs in the state. So that brings us up to about 56.
Another one in there. Didn't we do?
Yeah, 56, almost 60. You got 60 different entities in the state preparing teachers. So I'm with you, right? I'm with you on the big issues, right? I'm absolutely with you, right? I was a huge proponent of teaching fellows incentivizing high need subjects and high need schools. I was a proponent of the system in which they evaluated and determined who got teaching fellows was based on a weighted criteria, performance. So I'm 100% with you. I don't know how to measure what we value right now. And I'm just going to say right now, I don't know how to measure it. That doesn't mean it can't be measured. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be measured. I don't know how to do it right now. And if we have a way to measure it that's appropriate, I'm not even going to say equitable or fair or any of that. I'm just going to say appropriate, then I would be in favor of it. I just don't know how to do that right now. Know what you're trying to do too, right? And I agree with that too, is trying to incentivize this need in the state. We have an absolute need to staff schools, particularly hard to serve schools, and I just don't know how to do it.
Yep.
I don't know how to do it through this commission.
Yeah, it may not. I mean, it may not be that.
Not that it's not important though.
Yeah, it doesn't. This is great. At least for me, it's been great. I think it's worth exploring. I wouldn't feel like we were doing our diligence if we didn't explore it, even if we land on it. This isn't the right.
And I think that data is going to end up on the dashboard.
Yeah, I would think so.
It's going to be available. We're going to see it. I think right now what we're saying is we may not have a metric for it to hold programs accountable, other than the public accountability of it's out there. And it may be that this dashboard gets built and it's out there for a year or two, and we identify some things on the dashboard that we can assign accountability measures to, right?
Now we've come full circle, because that's what I said to begin with.
I wasn't here for that, so.
Yes, you were. I mean, not very first. We agree completely.
Well, I also think what was telling from Mrs. Andrew, I also think was telling and probably informational to this subcommittee is looking on the cross-state report that came in, the measures that they're using, despite they're probably equally interested in holding people and pushing in the right directions as well, their methods of accountability are not that sophisticated and certainly not scratching at the stuff that you're interested in putting into the accountability model, right? So other states are struggling with the same problem. You know, that should give you pause, right? It's not like they're, you know, well, look at this state, they're doing this.
I've got a meeting tomorrow on the teacher prep advisory group for the UNC system.
Yeah.
And we're actually looking at measures of exactly the things you're talking about. Schools are
Well, I'd love to know what comes out
holding
of that.
teacher prep programs accountable, and
Yeah.
actually holding UNC system schools, but because we have ways to hold UNC system schools accountable. Because we get public dollars, we have recruiters, we have all these other things that.
Well, I get so yeah. I would love to know what comes
Yeah.
out of that. Just for food for thought. I mean, I guess that might. I mean, Ann's already told me I'm being an activist judge over here, but I mean that does make me think. Can this, to your point, like you have that mechanism, you get state dollars, so you can hold those. I mean, that might be where my activism is hitting its peak here, which is I'm like, oh, but we as a commission actually do get to go back with a recommendation that says, like, you may not be getting state dollars if you're a private university or if you're Teach for America. Well, we are getting state dollars. But this is actually what we're going to hold EPPs accountable to, because you got to fill in a pretty strong because line so it doesn't just sound like because this is what Andrew thinks. And the world might not be ready for that. But I think if we're not at least exploring it, and it is, Kentucky has demographic data. That was the only one I could find, and we talked earlier. I have no idea how they measure that, or if how they measure it's actually aligned with this, or if it's working.
So, but I'm gonna push back on this, and,
Yes,
and
please
I
do.
completely believe in this, and we talk a lot about this at my institution. How do we recruit other people? What kind of programs could we create where we get more males in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So everyone has these conversations. But you're talking about an outcome-based program that's going to possibly shut a program down. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So just keep that in perspective. So if you're only producing white women teachers
Who are all effective.
who are all effective, is it? I mean, I'm just, I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm saying we're talking, what's the purpose of the program? What's the purpose of this? Of what we're doing? To evaluate programs.
Yeah, but I think and I just wrote this down because this is, I think we're evaluating, we're definitely evaluating how well you develop and prepare teachers.
Right. That's right.
I'm adding a layer here, which may or may not be worthwhile or the right thing to do. Who are you developing and preparing as teachers? There's two things I think you're actually measuring. You might get into like where they teach and how long they teach. Could be your next third question. And I agree. And I appreciate that push. And like also just appreciate the
You
space
also
of placing this
control
out.
your input. I do not.
Sure. Yeah.
Neither does he.
Right. The university.
I do not control my
Say more about
input.
that.
I do not control Elon input. Admissions
Kids who apply,
controls
kids who are
Elon
admitted.
input.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Application admission is is a complex. It's not in the hands.
I'm just talking about all the factors.
No. I appreciate. I
But
I really do.
But I think the
appreciate this.
broader market is a big issue too, right? So in that, if teacher prep enrollment statewide is down, that's its own challenge.
Yep.
And it's been down. It's down 30% in some instances, on some campuses, right? So there's a smaller pool in general. So I don't know. I don't know the right answer.
I think if you, beyond this becoming like a political or social cause thing, I think what would seem like good policy, maybe this isn't the commission's side, is that you want your teacher preparation portals to be somewhat aligned, matching to your student like North Carolina's student population. Now, granted, this is where it gets tricky because if you're sending 70% of your people here and Brevard's
Yeah.
West,
So I agree with that,
Tennessee.
right? I want the teacher population to match student population, but remember that's a generational thing, right? It's going to take a generation in order to get right because the generation who are teachers now, right, the majority of students when they were going through were white.
Yeah.
Right, so that shift takes time to occur. And I think there's the issue of what's the percentage of students in college? It's just a total number. We need more students of color going to college in the first place in order to turn out more teachers of color.
Yep. Yeah, well, and that's where you get to this at a systems level. I mean, it's just. Good thought.
I was just thinking, we got about 20 minutes before the top of an hour, and I was just wondering if we could steer this conversation towards next steps. Like, so I heard a couple things that I know Kim, and I was double booked, so I missed the beginning of this, so there's probably some other things, but I heard at the very least, we can cook up some data at each institution level, so that you guys can think
You do
about
the
that.
diversity thing and see how it looks.
Yeah, and then we can also check with Kentucky on how they use demographics in their model,
That's good.
because that may inform
Yeah.
some information there. I'm just wondering.
How about a little deep dive into what exactly each of those indicators mean in Georgia? Because they're very similar to ours.
So take a look at Georgia in greater depth.
Did you
I think-
wanna know anything about Florida too? You guys were talking about retention rates.
Yeah, we want to know, maybe we want to know how those things are defined in their states, right? Like the Georgia indicators, how are those defined? What is that? Who, what, when, where,
Yeah, what does
how?
that look like, right?
What does that look like?
What does it actually
And I
look
think
like?
retention rate in Florida would be another good one.
Okay.
So all the things that we've bounced back and forth, and that would be great if y'all could help us do that.
Yes. Any other states that you actually want us to look at? Or any other measures that you were interested in other states?
Did you look at Tennessee?
Can't
I
remember.
believe Tennessee is in
I
that
think they
report.
were in that report, but don't quote me.
Let's look.
You're speaking to the person who hasn't been available.
Texas.
I mean, because when you talk about a state that's similar to what we've done, they've done, that we might want to pull out Tennessee.
I think I personally looked at Tennessee for sanctions, but I can look up things for Tennessee.
Thank you.
They also use their value added a lot more
Yeah.
vigorously than we do.
So it
have
might
more-
be
they have more
interesting to
tests.
see what their model looks like.
Yeah, they have more tests than we do.
Yeah.
They
But
have a nice way too, if they actually do a really good job of connecting graduates with employment. I did a
So,
little work in
see, it's a
Tennessee,
good-
helping
it's a
with
good
accreditation,
suggestion.
And their
You're
report card's really
welcome.
nice.
Thanks, Ann.
You're welcome. I mean, I think it's another, I'd like to come to the next, I would like to come to the next
Yeah, I think
subcommittee
so,
meeting
too.
on this, so could I know when that is? as
No, I'm
well?
not on the subcommittee,
We need to
I'm
come
not
to
even on
these.
this subcommittee,
You guys are our expert
Yes, we are on leadership.
but it's a good one.
thought partners.
No, this is
today.
good, this is a good group.
We appreciate you being here for the community. Yes, representation.
I think this is a fascinating conversation. It's very similar to what I said to the Governor's Commission, what we're talking about today. Yeah,
So
whatever that thing's.
We got
I
a lot
mean,
of people talking about teacher prep accountability.
are you guys, did you find the documents that we collected and put together helpful, the way we put them together? Is there anything you want to do differently than how we have that laid out in terms of discussion points?
When is this subcommittee meet again, do you,
It
Figure that out.
depends.
might wanna,
I don't know, it might want
It's
to be in
something that
January.
we can definitely do next month. I can send out.
well, we might wanna wait a little bit until we know a little more, have a little more clarity on the MK9.
Maybe we want to influence it though. Maybe we want to go the other way.
But, I mean, if we have all the state information that Andrew and I would like, I mean, maybe that.
Might be good to have,
Are you- You came to send him an email.
I'm going his off January 8th.
So this,
I want these to align.
yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
It's just going to be a lot of work on the back end.
I'm just thinking, I just want this subcommittee to be sensitive to the fact that the clock is ticking too. So if we say things like, let's wait until this next legislative thing.
Yeah.
Well, maybe, since I think I'm supposed to be the one hearing the clock ticking and working with the subcommittee to move it forward.
I have known Andrew for a long time. Let me put that on.
She has. Ann and I have solved a lot of licensure issues over the years that had no easy answer. If we were to, if the baseline is what we're to go with, which we kind of laid out earlier, Andrew, before you got here, but like, hey, there's these 6 things, they're here, you know, we might tweak this or that or provide a little bit more detail of this, but this is it. And we can do a weight with it. Although we did have the question around percentages, or if it's
Yeah,
just
whether
a
we
yes
weight it or
no.
whether we do more of a criterion, like you either meet this or you don't.
So I think that's another thing we need to work through as a subcommittee. But it would seem like there's a baseline path that is not all that disruptive. It's kind of, you know, here's what it would be. I guess my question would be, like, if we were to go that path and we just explore a couple of the other states and, you know, pull this yarn a little bit, that would seem like a pretty straightforward path. I know that there would still be work involved with that, but like, it doesn't seem like there'd be a ton of different work. It would just be like, here are our criteria, here's the sampling we've done, here's what we propose as weights, here it is. It would feel like if we start to get into some of these and we learn something from Kentucky, or we look at Tennessee and we're like, ooh, our bar should be higher, then it would create.
That's why I wondered if you want to,
Yeah.
do a quick turnaround of getting like a little more deeper subcommittee meeting. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, that's one piece, and then it's long-term, right?
Yeah. I guess I'm just asking a process question of, like, you know, from y'all's estimation of, we know the clock's ticking, we know we have to deliver something. You probably have a sense of, like, how fast that clock might be ticking, or the amount of work. You know, you brought this up on the last call. Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, like what? And that maybe doesn't have to be a full we could talk about that, just so I'm clear and the rest of the subcommittee members are clear. I can see 2 paths, and probably a lot of paths in between. One where we keep going deep and like shaking this up. One where, like, oh, the law is pretty straightforward based on what we've seen from SREB. We would tweak this a little bit, tweak that a little bit, but here's our things, and here's the model. That path seems like the least amount of work.
We could at least get it off the ground as a
Yeah,
place to
most
start.
expeditiously as kind of like your baseline model. And then you keep tinkering with some of these other things and develop a few models that would, you know, look different, but you've kind of got this baseline one already.
Are there folks that are on this call remotely, and are they in alignment with that?
Van said.
Dr. Graham is still on. He was having trouble with his technology.
So I would
But
say,
everyone else is gone.
so if Anthony has any comments, he could just email them to y'all and to Andrew or Andrew.
Andrew and Andrew.
Not Andrew. Andrew.
I'm just saying, like, if Anthony's, you know.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's been instrumental in, I think, bringing a lot of stuff. You know, I like his voice in the conversation because
Absolutely.
he's
He is a provost now.
I know, it's kind of a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Okay, so it sounds like the next steps are gonna be us cook up some of these other states,
Right.
us cook up 3 years of data,
Define some of the things.
and define Georgia.
And define the others. She's got the
The
list.
other states.
And you got that. Once we have that, we can send that over to the subcommittee chair.
It will be after the holiday, but we will get it
Yeah, we'll probably get
done
it,
as soon as
I
possible.
would say in the first week or 2 of
Yes.
January, we'll have that
We will
cooked.
turn that around pretty quickly.
We're still working on late March, early April
We
timeline.
can-
Yeah, if we
We
can.
can send that to you,
Yeah,
Andrew,
that
and
sounds
then
great.
we can decide from there about having another subcommittee
Yep.
meeting or,
Yep.
you know, how we want
I think that sounds great.
to.
It works for me.
Dr. Dempsey, you still on?
No,
He's off?
he
Okay.
had to go to the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody let me know.
Okay, so you feel good about the,
Yeah, this was, I know we went back and forth and there was a lot of like, you know, digging in, but it is super helpful to hear perspectives, y'all's perspectives, to really push and challenge and not get stuck in one line of thinking. and just uncover some other things we should be looking at. So I'm greatly appreciative, and we'll follow up with Dr. Graham. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
As a matter of fact, I might get Dr. Graham's contact information. I'd love to just call him and hear his thoughts.
Yeah, I think he'd be
I
helpful.
told him to email me if he.
Awesome. Great.
I'll pass that on to you, but I will send you.
That'd be great.
Or I'll just connect you through email.
That's perfect. Thanks.
Anything else for the good of the cause?
Don't think so. Not for me.
Let's,
I'm great.
all right, so let's turn the mics off for the meeting, and, we'll be in touch as soon as we get some stuff put together.
Journal subcommittee.
I was trying not to say on public record because I have no idea these days where the stuff lands. Are we
yeah.
still recording?
Andrew, I have to say you're looking tired.
I look tired.
You look tired.
Yeah, I feel tired. I need a break.
So one of the comments I made